Welcome everyone. Sorry, apologies for the technical hitches. My name is Ian Cable. Welcome to our event for Building Speed and Addressing the Climate Crisis, Big Levers, Public Persuasion and Technologies to Do It. I work in the Environment Agency. I'm one of the CFCA coordinators. This is a kind of our inaugural event to welcome everyone to the new platform, which you can free to join now, but if you're already on Slack with us, then you will be getting transferred over in the next few days. So that's going to be like a platform for like hosting events, messaging, publishing our work, and basically just sharing everything we do and breaking down those silos that's such a bugbear for the whole of the public sector. This event is being recorded, but it's not being streamed. It will be available on our YouTube channel next week at the latest. If you can put the questions you have into the Slido, I'll put the link in the chat again. Just look out for those. And I'm being co-hosted with Simon, who'll be dealing with all the questions later. So Simon, if you just want to introduce yourself really quickly.
We're going to confuse us all with two Simons on the call, but hi everyone, it's good to see so many of you. I'm Simon DeGaris from Innovate UK KTN, and you'll find out a little bit more about us after the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. I guess today I'll start with Simon because he's going to go first now. We've got Simon Sharp. Simon's the Director of Economics at the United Nations Climate Champions. He's also a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, and he's previously worked as a Deputy Director of the UK Government's COP26 unit and head of the International Climate Strategy at BEIS. His book, 5 Times Faster, is compellingly interlinks science, diplomacy and economics as vital levers for our race against climate change. We've also got Suzan Krumdieck from Herriot University, and she's a professor at the School of Energy, Geoscience and Infrastructure and Society. Her research focuses on engineering methods and innovation to reduce the fossil fuel production and consumption, publishing over 160 peer-reviewed works. She's also the co-founder of the GATE, the Global Association for Transition Engineering, and she was awarded the Queen's Honours for her service to sustainability and engineering in 2020. And finally, we've got Nameerah Hameed. She's the Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach, the charity and think tank who work on climate communication. She's worked in climate policy for the public sector and development bodies. She's an expert on climate and behavioural change, and in the recent report that she helped to publish was towards a UK public engagement strategy on climate change, and it outlines vital components on the effectiveness or the effective government climate engagement strategy. She also spoke at the UK Presidency Programme panel in COP26 in Glasgow as an expert on public engagement on climate change. So I'll hand over to Simon Sharp now to talk about his work, and then we'll move on to our other speakers.
Cool. Thank you, Ian. Hello, everybody. Great to be with you. Before I start on my own spiel, I just want to say thanks to Ian and massive credit to you for creating this network. I think this is really cool. There's in every single part of government, there's useful stuff that people can do on climate change, and it's definitely going to be helpful for everyone to be talking to each other. So really happy to be here at the first event of the network. So let me make sure you can see my slides.
We can see them. There we go.
Good. All right. So this is going to be a very quick sharing of some of the ideas from my book, which Ian already mentioned, 5 Times Faster, Rethinking the Science, Economics and Diplomacy of Climate Change. And it was during our presidency of COP26 that I found myself repeatedly using the phrase 5 times faster, because I was telling people that over the last 2 decades, the global economy had decarbonized at the rate of roughly 1.5% per year. But over this decade, we need to decarbonize at about 8% per year. And that's a huge acceleration. So the question is, how do we do that? What do we need to change? And a lot of the time that I spent in the last 10 years or so working on this from different parts of the UK government made me feel that it wasn't just the physical infrastructure of the global economy that we need to change. It was also some invisible infrastructure, the infrastructure of ideas and institutions, the way we think about things and the way that we make decisions. And so the book obviously talks about that in 3 areas. I'm just going to mention 2 of them briefly today. I'm skipping out the part about science and risk assessment, but we could come back to that in the discussion if people want to. So mainly I'll talk about economics and then a brief word at the end on diplomacy. So this is a project I'm involved with researchers from the UK, China, India, and Brazil. And it's understanding the economics of the transition And the first thing it did was look back at the most outstanding successes we've had so far, the cost-reducing, job-creating, clean technology diffusing successes of the low-carbon transition in these different parts of the world. And we found that, on the whole, they were generally due to policies that were implemented despite and not because of the dominant economic analysis. In other words, the economic advice was going against the things that were done that proved to be the most successful. I think that's something that should concern us a lot. So why would that happen? Well, it's because most of the economic ideas, concepts, analytical tools that we use in government, and that are also most widely used outside government, take as their starting point an assumption of equilibrium. They don't always tell you that, but that's actually their conceptual starting point. And that's defined as a situation in which nobody has any immediate reason to change their actions so that the status quo can continue, at least temporarily. Contrast that with what the IPCC says we need to do to meet climate goals: rapid and far-reaching system transitions, unprecedented in terms of scale. A system transition is where you change one family of technologies and everything that goes with it, the business strategies, the institutions, infrastructure, all of that, with another set of technologies and all those things that go around it. So that's a situation where everybody has a reason to change their actions and the status quo gets completely turned upside down. So that's very, very different. So that difference affects how we think about the economy itself and how we think about the role of policy. If your starting point is a stable, fixed equilibrium economy, then you're thinking about it like a machine. And the role of policy most of the time is to leave it alone. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The role of policy is just to fix it when it fails. If you're thinking about the economy in a disequilibrium sense, in other words, I would say a realistic sense, then you're thinking about it less like a machine and more like an ecosystem. It is constantly changing and evolving. There are many different directions it could go in. Some of those you'll like, some of those you won't like. And so the role of policy there is not to fix it when it fails, because there is no failure and there is no success in any objective sense. The role of policy is to steer and guide the evolution of this system so that it evolves in a direction that is good for society, whatever society thinks is good. So that provides a much more positive role for policy. Now, what does it mean for specific policy instruments? Well, obviously, this is very generalized and brief, but I think it's important. First of all, we've all been told that the most efficient way to decarbonize is through a carbon price. But when we look at where has all the success come from so far in the transition, it's actually come from policies focused on investment in the new clean technologies. And where we've done that, the success has not just been small, it's been, as in this example, far, far more than any of the governments or analysts tended to expect. In this example, deploying more than 10 times as much solar globally by 2020 as everybody expected about 15 years before. Now, we can understand why that happens. It happens because new technologies benefit from these reinforcing feedbacks, self-amplifying feedbacks. The more you make them, the better you get at making them, the cheaper they get, and the more other technologies emerge that make them more useful. So there are many of these self-amplifying feedbacks, and they all work together. That's why you get non-linear growth and deployment and non-linear reductions in cost. You benefit from these when you invest in the new technologies. If you just tax the old technologies, then you might not. Early in the transition, it's quite likely that taxing the old economy, the old technologies, just makes that fossil-based economy operate slightly more efficiently. Doesn't give you the help of any of that self-amplification. Second important tool of policy, that first was investment. I'm saying it's a good thing, it's underrated. Second is regulation, even more so. Most of the government guidance about regulation is do it as little as possible. Only do it when you have to. Only do it when it fixes a market failure. The assumption is that it increases cost. That's a natural belief that arises from the underlying assumption that the economy was perfect to start with. It was in an equilibrium and you shouldn't disrupt it. But here's an example actually done by a guy who used to be Energy Secretary in the USA, Stephen Chu, worked for Barack Obama. He did this study and showed that, in fact, historically, the opposite has happened, that certain kinds of regulation have led to an acceleration of cost reduction. Now, why would that happen? We can understand it when we think of the economy as an ecosystem. The rate of evolution is inversely proportional to the fitness of the population for its environment. So when you regulate, you're changing the fitness function. You're saying, you inefficient fridges, you are no longer fit for your environment. You won't be profitable. In fact, you can't even be sold. And you're forcing those companies to innovate harder. So they have to reallocate some of their resources. Instead of just advertising their inefficient products, they have to spend some of those resources on developing new and better products instead. That's why regulation can lead to faster innovation and faster cost reduction. Thirdly, on tax, the traditional advice is you should internalize the externality. That means if you have a carbon price, it should reflect the damage done by climate change. But what's the damage done by climate change? It's whatever you want it to be. It's an entirely subjective number, somewhere between 0 and infinity, according to an IPCC report in 2013. What's a more useful way to think of tax? Well, it can help you cross tipping points where the relative cost, not the absolute cost, the relative cost is what matters. You can make a clean technology cheaper than a fossil, or the most polluting technology the most expensive of all in a system. And we see that happening in the world's fastest power sector decarbonisation, that was the UK, and the world's fastest transition to electric vehicles, which was Norway. It's a really obvious thing to do, but you can see from these examples that, in fact, these are the exception rather than the rule. Policymakers haven't been looking for tipping points as much as they should be. And of course, in each of the emitting sectors, that tipping point is in a very different place. So the traditional recommendation to have an equal carbon price across the whole economy based on static equilibrium thinking is in fact completely wrong. That's a hopelessly inefficient thing to do. If you're interested in more of this stuff, you can have a look at this website, east.co.uk. This is where a lot of the materials have been put from the last three years of work of academics from the UK, China, India, and Brazil on this project. That's enough on economics, and for the sake of time, I'll be really, really brief on diplomacy. The main thing I want to say is that this different understanding of the economics of transitions leads to a very different way of thinking about diplomacy. If you're thinking of the economy as fundamentally fixed and unchanging, then the job of climate change diplomacy is how to divide up the pie of the fixed global carbon budget. And that is naturally decarbonization as a cost. So that's a negative sum game, a burden sharing game. However, if you understand that the economy can and does change, and that in future it can be better than it was in the past, then in fact, you're not thinking of the global carbon pie, you're thinking of the S-curve of technology transitions. And because the future can be better than the past, you can have a positive sum game of climate change diplomacy. This is the game that, in fact, the UK government, our embassies around the world, are working to promote through the Breakthrough Agenda, which was launched at COP26. So I think that is where I will end. There's a load more stuff online if anyone would like to have a look, and very much looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists and joining in the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. I'm just going to share Suzan's slides now so she can kick off.
Great. Thanks, Simon. I think we're going to see another way to look at things from me. I am a mechanical engineer. I went into engineering back in the 80s, but I also studied anthropology because to me, the most amazing thing I can think of is that the human species exists. And the second most amazing thing is that we still exist, because how good are we at sorting things out, really? Good question. And so my research area, since I went into energy, renewable energy, good energies, things like that, and sustainability, was how do we fill in the blank? I hear this phrase all the time. How do we? And I thought, okay, if you want to know how do we build a 75-story building, you ask an engineer. If you want to know how to get across a river without getting your feet wet, you ask a civil engineer, etc. So shouldn't we be answering this question? Shouldn't engineers be in here? And it felt like we were to me because, of course, I was working on solar, hydrogen, carbon capture, biofuels, energy efficiency, etc. But let me tell you where I got to on this, because I have a big challenge for you. So next slide. How do we? All right, the next slide sets up the technical enterprise as the things that we do in the economy. They're making money, they're legal, they're returning value to shareholders, they're going faster and faster and bigger and better, and they're heading right into absolute danger, like must not go there, right? Well, those are all engineered systems. I know people don't think about the engineering very much, but when you look at a list of the things that people trust, the professions that people trust, engineering is always right at the top, even above doctors, way above lawyers. But here's the question, what are we working on? And the answer from my people is whatever you pay us to work on. Oh, that's not a great answer. We do actually work in other ways. And the argument that I'm going to give you is that we work, yes, on what we're paid to do, but we also work on preventing what's preventable. And the story behind that changes everything. Because if we are cruising along at top speed and there's some levers that are being pulled, like Simon just talked to us about, oh, there could be a price on that, there could be a policy on this, there could be science coming in saying, this doesn't look great. But the thing is still barreling along. And the only way to change the direction is to do it. That's what you have to do. And what that seems like is that there must be in the world the profession of transition engineering, the profession, the discipline, which is actually a transdiscipline. It goes throughout all engineering and it affects and has participation in all fields that creates the transition mechanisms that actually shift things one project at a time. So hit the next button and you'll get transition engineering coming up. So transition engineering has to have a research backing, as all engineering does, but this research backing has to be action research. It has to be not in a lab, but in a living lab, right? Because we have to be working on the transition mechanisms of real systems going real fast. And we have to do it quickly, as Simon said. And that means we need professional organizations, we need discipline, we need the development of tools and methods, we need the ways to communicate these things, standards, training, education, and then the actual projects happening, being demonstrated, tested, and accelerated commercially. All right. To that end, the Global Association for Transition Engineering was formed 10 years ago. Membership is growing. This year in 2020, I published the textbook, Transition Engineering, which I have heard from a lot of business people. They think this is really good. So it's not just for engineers, but engineers tell me, well, this opens up a whole new way of thinking. I can give myself permission, no matter what I'm working on, to actually look for those transition mechanisms because I now have an approach and a method to do that. So the argument that we can work to prevent what's preventable, I'm going to prove that to you by evidence now. So next slide. And the evidence is that we have, in fact, done this before. Cast your mind back to 1911. This was okay. This was profitable. This was legal. This was not against the law. This did not have a policy saying it could not exist. There was not a price on the cost of line workers dying on the job. That isn't what changed it. What changed it was something called safety engineering. And that was a very strange thing that happened, actually. It was about being honest about what the problems are. Next, it was about preventing what's preventable. And it was about doing the engineering so that you didn't kill people. You still had legal stuff. You still had profitable stuff. But you just didn't kill people. And now we just take that for granted. But if you go back and you look into history, what you'll see is that this thing called duty of care is so much more powerful than the price on something. Doing things because we must, that is what changes things successfully. So next, I'm going to give you even more proof. This is the first piece of evidence, which is safety engineering exists. It started in 1911 and went forward. Next slide, you'll see that that isn't the only time we did this. We've done it over and over and over. And when it happens is when we can see that that great, profitable, legal, everything that we're doing is also really bad. So usually we would just have dissonance. We'd just be going, oh, it's really good, but oh, it's really bad. But corrective transdiscipline is the way that you smash that dissonance by action. So look into it. These are only a few examples. As far as I found, there's 52 different disciplines that actually deal the corrective to the system. And my proposition is that transition engineering is the next one. All right. So next slide. Oh, how will we do it? Well, I'll just do it. So here's the theory. And the theory is that I am not the only one who's been working on how do we do what we got to do. The theory is that in the 80s, when I went into energy engineering, that as a teenager, it was because I knew very well that climate change was a really, really big problem, except we called it global warming back then. We already knew that biological diversity was being trampled. We already knew, I mean, geez, we already knew, right? And so there has to be at least 10,000 people who were like that, or 100,000 people. There has to be a lot of people over the last 40 years who've been thinking, we got to do something, right? And what I'm pretty sure of is that at least 30% of those people, it's just a theory, haven't proved it yet, but at least 30% of the aware people have actually done something in their thinking, in their career. They have become sustainability champions. Now, the problem with that is that we haven't had a discipline. And so the sustainability champions have been pulling very hard on their rope in a bunch of directions. And now 40 years later, we're also far apart from each other, and we're also dedicated that we can't figure out where it is we all converge. So the theory that I'm going to give you is that when even just 10% of those 30% of those aware people get together and say, okay, there's going to be this corrective transdiscipline, we're going to create it, and then we're going to teach it, it's going to flow back out the way transdisciplines always do. Why? Because it's better when you do the right thing. But you gotta have a discipline, you gotta have methods, you gotta have an approach. All right, so when we do that, that's when we're going to start to see these amazing swings. Now we've got a lot to build on because we have made things more efficient before, but we've been really busy, at least in the engineering professions, of making things more sustainably unsustainable. So a corrective is a totally different thing. It's downshifting what's unsustainable. And yes, there's a lot of values that you can create in that, but it's different than decoupling, because I don't know that the decoupling is actually decoupling, because when I look at the emissions, it's going up, right? So it's actual downshift. More solar doesn't downshift the use of petrol in cars, right? So we got to start working on those actual downshifts. All right, and my finale, what I think we need to do right now is a Manhattan Project, right? Because we're all out there. There's all of us out there, like I said, pulling in our own directions. I call it the sustainability diaspora, right? We've all gone in different directions, and we need a home. We need that power of discipline, that power of jargon, of understanding, of the way that we charge for the work that we now are going to do. Right? Because this is a different work stream, the actual transition engineering, the engineering of the transitions. So the conclave, the Manhattan Project, a place where we bring together the economists, that, everybody who's in that sustainability diaspora, and we figure out how it all goes together, create a discipline, and Herriot University will be the first to teach it. and set up a research department or a research facility for that. And that is why I came from New Zealand to Scotland, was to set up the transition engineering discipline. And I would love to have that convergence, that Manhattan Project early this year, so we can get going on this. All right, so if you're looking at this organodiagram of what this corrective transdiscipline for shifting what's unsustainable down to where the science says, applying the science to see where, to get to where we have to be, and engineering the changes, that you do realize we have to do that, right? That's work. Then we'll add it in, but that's what the Manhattan Project of Transition is about figuring out how we all go together to get these jobs done. That's my contribution to the discussion today. And you're right,
Thanks.
It's not end of pipe.
Thanks very much, Susan.
Sure.
Nameerah, I haven't heard from you in the chat. Are you good to go?
Yes, I'm good to go. I don't have slides, so I'll just sort of go ahead. Thank you so much for having us from Climate Outreach today. It's such a pleasure to be amongst this excellent panel. So that's doubly thank you. Just as an introduction to Climate Outreach, we are experts in climate engagement and communications with 20 years of expertise in talking meaningfully with different audiences about the climate transition. And sharing insights from social science to help policymakers build a popular mandate for rapid decarbonization. Through our work that we've done, which is engaging directly with people across the UK, we are learning that there are ways to have better conversations that engage and bring people into the climate conversation. Our research has been making a case for a while that communicating about lifestyle change, that individual actions and systemic level actions are two sides of the same coin. We know that around 62% of the UK's net zero target requires some form of individual action, whether it's how we travel, how we eat, what we eat, how we heat our homes, or how willingly we go along with ambitious climate policies. For this, there is a central role for communication and public engagement to change the way sustainable lifestyles are discussed in public forums and to emphasize the complex relationship between systems and behavior. We believe that behavior change is ultimately about a social mandate, where people across a society give their informed consent for the change, knowing what it means for their lives and how they can participate in it as well. In the UK, we simply are not there yet, but we could be. We need to build a whole lot of trust for that work. Communicating where actions would be most impactful and that changes to lifestyles are a necessary component to meeting global emissions reduction targets is a powerful tool for policymakers. One of our sort of prime research works that we do, it's called Britain Talks Climate. Through it, we learned that 64% of people agree that the UK should be one of the most ambitious countries in the world on climate action. There is a strong consensus across all audience segments in the UK, regardless of their values, regardless of their identities, that climate change concerns all of us. Studies also inform us that most people are making changes in their own lives for environmental and climate reasons. So while we look at the UK public through a worldview approach, we find that there are 7 broad segments of this public. While there are segments with very different, often clashing values, there is common ground on the issue of climate change, whether that's climate policies to preserve local environments, to benefit everyone's health, to support future generations, or a just transition to build economic prosperity. There are evidence-based, compelling narrative frameworks that open the doors to meaningful conversations with everyone. But people currently don't see what action they need to take to help us get where we need to get at a national level and a global level. For many people, there isn't enough communication about what this energy transition means for everyone's futures. So we see that only 28% of Britons agree that the government has a clear plan. Recent experience has shown us that in this communications vacuum, there are groups of people that are resisting change. The crux of this is that they feel it is being done to them without engaging them effectively first. And we are not engaging with people to help shape ambitious climate policies. This means these policies are in a danger of working poorly, requiring costly adjustments, going against public concerns about fairness, and suffering from public backlash. Our research shows us, in line with the wider studies of public opinion, that trust in government is at an all-time low. 2/3 of participants in our Britain Talks Climate think that the system is rigged against them. And so skepticism or fear about net zero policies is very unsurprising. There is a crisis of trust, and decision makers are failing to address it by engaging people and building consensus around the common challenge we all face. The government's latest published attitude tracker on net zero also shows 41% of respondents felt they knew only a little or hardly anything about the issue, and 10% saying they had never heard of it. Alongside this, we see a lack of trusted messengers as well. In the run-up to COP26, which was hosted in the UK, we surveyed the British public again and asked them who they trusted to tell them about climate action. While every segment trusted David Attenborough, figures like him are very short in supply. The lowest levels of trust across the board were in our political leaders on climate. The most frustrated segments, for example, in our study, we call them loyal nationals. They explained why. They don't feel represented by these leaders and they think they are hypocrites. So we believe that a key missing piece of the puzzle is sustained ongoing public engagement and education. Reaching net zero will mean changes for everyone in their daily lives, and public engagement is a way to positively involve everyone in this journey. So that's the good news for today, that we learned through our research that most people, regardless of their value, regardless of their identity, and regardless of their political affiliation, most people will lean towards climate change positively if they are framed in a way that connects with their values and their identity. So to conclude a lot of what our work suggests, we need a government nationwide public engagement strategy on net zero. Think of public engagement as a core function of the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, joined up with policy, regulation, and financing. We believe there is a critical role for communities, charities, local government, and businesses to be involved in the co-design and delivery of this national public engagement, which should take place in communities, workplaces, and everywhere in between. We suggest that this is co-designed strategy and it's coordinated regionally by local authorities. One ask for today, at Climate Outreach, we would love to hear more from you, the audience, about what the government would like support on, how to engage with people. And just to conclude, 3 key messages from today from our side. Participation in climate is about building active consent, a sense of fairness, and most critically, trust in transition. People need to see the climate story as their story. They need to see that it reflects their values and they are involved in shaping it. Number 3, and lastly, we need to inspire people to take action that makes sense for them and their circumstances, and listening to them to get policies right and fair. With that, I thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Nameerah. That's really interesting stuff to know. And Climate Outreach do some really amazing work on all of this. I haven't actually got any announcements over and above the fact that we're moving to the new platform. Also, to just pop any of your questions in the Slido. I'll stick the link in the chat again, and also upvote some of the ones that you want to be asked, just so it makes it easier for us. Yeah, now I'll just hand over to Simon to deal with your questions.
Yeah, and a bit of an introduction as well to the hub and how this partnership came around. So Simon de Garis, a knowledge transfer manager at Innovate UK KTN. I work within the PLACE team supporting local authorities achieve their net zero goals, and with the businesses as well who can solve some of those problems. So if you are a local authority or the wider public sector, because there are so many of you on today and the conversations going on are fantastic, please do reach out to us. And I think the best way to do that is on Gov News Direct, because we're all on there. So do post on there, do get in touch. So a connection between the hub and KTN had been made just before I started, actually, and it makes absolute sense. The most striking part of this partnership for me was the people that we would be working with. volunteering around full-time jobs to support and develop net zero. So without the commitment of individuals like Heather, Ian, Sam, Chris, Mike, May, Oliver, Giz, all of these fantastic people and so many more of you that I could mention are an absolute driving force to what we're doing here. Having worked in a local authority for a number of years, I was very aware of how siloed we really were. I couldn't have told you what was going on in a department next door to us, let alone in other organisations, local authorities, our NHS trust, whoever across the area. So it is really, really important to be part of a group like this. And actually seeing some of the questions today and some of the conversations on previously Slack, now on Gov News, you get that experience of knowledge and support and advice, activities, funding that you might not have known about, just this wealth of knowledge and innovation that helps to bring us all together. Heather also mentioned in the chat well-being, and I remember meeting Heather in one of our group chats in my first week or two and being asked, how was I getting on? I'd met dozens of people with different activities, with different priorities. It's pretty overwhelming. And I think we all felt like that in that way. And this is a great thing about the group. Not only have we got that practical help and support, but that well-being support behind it as well. So I can't speak highly enough of everything going on here. So as I mentioned, if there's anything that we at KTN can do to help and support you or the Cross Government Climate Hub, then do reach out and speak to us. So enough about me. I'm going to move to some of your questions. So panel, I would just shout a question out. If it's within your area or you want to answer, please do go for it. Otherwise you'll have me trying to make up an answer. So for Susan, straight away, how to talk to engineers working in local government to do things differently in order to make our infrastructure more resilient to climate impacts.
All right, yeah, the communication piece is interesting. And I do have 20 years in New Zealand where we were doing this. And so what we found there is that the two needs to meet, the client and the engineering firm, because the engineering firm can only do what it's paid to do, but the client can only ask for what's on the menu. So the two getting together, that's where all of our previous benefits that we have realized have come from. If you don't know where LED lights came from, that was a collision of universities, light makers, the power company, regulators in California that said, okay, let's do one of these Manhattan Project things and let's figure out how to get this science that it looks like is possible to create illumination with very small amount of electricity into product. But there has to be regulation on that. There has to be codes. There has to be, you have to build a whole industry around the transition. So that's one of my favorite examples of change. So the way to create that conversation is to create the conversation. Okay, that's a lame answer. But get the engineer's attention by saying, look, as clients, we want this thing called transition engineering. We know you can get trained up in that in a short amount of time. We know that there's resources. We know you can deliver it. We know that you can figure out what it will cost to add that. And we know that we can ask you to do it. So yeah, product development and delivery, that's the easier answer.
Amazing, thank you. Easier answer. That's what we like to hear. Nameerah, there's one that's come in for you from Rianne. I know climate outreach does work with the media to change how they talk about climate change, and there's a couple of comments on there about that, about how we use those words, what we do. So, for example, heat waves. Do you have any success stories of how you've sort of implemented that and the change it's made?
Yeah, no, exactly. So I'll answer this in two parts. So one is we do give trainings and workshops to different segments. So we give trainings to other NGOs that are working in this space on how they can communicate better instead of alienating people. And we are also looking to give trainings to public sector officials and some sort of dialogue with the media as well. So I'll give one example. From a study research that I mentioned earlier about Britain Talks Climate, we realized that there's a big segment in the UK that sort of doesn't understand and doesn't sort of support climate justice at a global level. they wouldn't necessarily feel motivated to act if there is floods or famine in some other part of the world. They would feel more inspired to act to save the bees in the local environment, in the local sort of borough. And this is a sort of a critical gap in understanding the audiences that we are dealing with, because it's only a matter of how we change certain words. So instead of using words like climate justice, using words like climate fairness and sort of the values around fairness for their local lives would change the perception and change their willingness to act incredibly. So that's sort of one very simple example, but a very important key distinction that would help.
That's really interesting. I think we have some master's students who have been talking on the chat. So I think there is a whole dissertation there about the language that we use and how we implement that. So that'd be a really interesting study. So there are a few questions around bringing together public sector organisations for one banner or under one project. But I guess the main one coming out there is when working in the public sector, how can we enhance net zero in our organisations and our local area, especially behaviours, when we have strongly differing political or climate views? Who would like that one?
I could put in a thing there, and that is I encourage everybody to study history. Human behavior is very predictable. We do what we normally do. So if you study history, what you'll see is that like 1911, when 62 mechanical engineers got together and decided to basically change the future. Well, okay, that wasn't what they were thinking. They were, but they had to prevent what's preventable. They wanted to do something differently. And what you'll see is the climate that they were in. They were extremely secretive about that. Because if somebody would have found out they were having that meeting, they might have actually gotten gunned down. Because you don't mess with the powers that be. You don't mess with the big corporations, and the politicians couldn't figure this out. And just 39 people a day dying in mines in the U.S. for example, factories on steamships, yeah. So this idea that that for some reason it shouldn't be contentious because it's climate change and we've got the science. No, that's not how change works in human dynamics. So to maybe recognize that these changes always do happen, and there's always going to be that pushback. I mean, for heaven's sake, when women's suffrage passed in your country, was it 99.9% to 0.1? No, it was not. It was 50-50. Passed by a tick. All right. So get over that. Move forward. If you have the correct unassailable argument, then you just keep moving in your direction and find others to come with you.
Fantastic, Simon.
I just want to add a couple of points to that. I certainly agree with what you said, Susan. One thing is, if we actually understand something about the systems we're dealing with and how to change them, then you can find there are some ways that are more effective in bringing about change than others. And the reason why I mentioned at the beginning of my short presentation that the difference between investing in the new and taxing the old at the beginning of the transition is, if you make the wrong choice there, you can waste a huge amount of effort. You can waste political will, you can waste money, you can push really hard on something and achieve very little. Whereas if you focus your energies on building up the new system, helping it grow, then you tend to receive compound interest on everything you do. And the more you grow the new system, the closer you get to the point where it's better, it's more attractive, it's more profitable, it's cheaper, everybody wants it, and then it becomes less difficult to let go of the old. So that's quite an important principle. The one other thing I'd say, and this is maybe not so much on the politics, but just how you think about effective action from different points in the system. often people assume that the thing they should concentrate on is the carbon footprint, whether that's at an individual level or an organizational level. I certainly agree with what Nameerah said, that there's no conflict between that and thinking about system change. But I would say that carbon footprint as an idea was promoted more vigorously by an oil firm than by anybody else. And there was a good reason for that. They wanted to distract people from thinking sensibly about system change. So whenever I get asked, what should we do about climate change? I say, don't think so much about your footprint. Think about your point of leverage. What is it that you can do better than most can do to bring about system change? I think that applies at the organizational level just as much as it does at the individual level. So, if you're a battery making firm, I don't care whether you're using electricity from a grid that has coal plants burning coal at the other end. I care about, can you make the best batteries that anyone's ever made that will help decarbonize all parts of our energy systems? So I think even if you're a local government, you can think in similar ways. What are the areas where you could do something really innovative and interesting that other people haven't done, and share it with other local governments around the country? That's probably more important than whether you, within your one small area, feel like you're getting close to net zero by 2050.
It's fantastic, and absolutely that sharing, coming from a knowledge transfer background, sharing that knowledge is vital. And we've seen some fantastic opportunities where local authorities have come together, one at the end of the journey, one right at the start, and talking that through to find all the pitfalls, the difficulties, the easy bits, to really work it out and understand it. That's really vital. There's a question from Mick, and I guess this topic has been on everybody's mind for the last few weeks, months, maybe years. But there is an opportunity with an election looming. What can the public do, but also, I guess, from a local authority level or an officer level, where you are in those silos, what can you do to influence future manifestos, future policies that can drive climate change and climate actions? Ooh.
I'll just say something very quickly. I think for us, something that we really want to hone in on this year, especially with the election coming in and everything, is we really need to see a public engagement strategy, even if it has a local level, and then we go up to a national level. But we need a concerted effort from the public sector to engage the public on climate engagement. So that's a very short, a very simple, but very important step from our side.
Absolutely. So there's some fantastic chats about decarbonising houses going on with insulating wallpaper. I've never heard of that, and I'm now going to have to go and have a search. So thank you for sharing that. Another one that's got probably, I think, the most likes there, whether one of you can answer, but how do we stop subsidies for carbon intensive energy? How do we stop opening new coal mines and oil drilling and throw that money at wind, solar, hydro, etc. instead? That's one of the wicked questions there.
That is actually a research project we have underway, in fact. And I think it's really interesting because I think it's your "and" part that was wrong. Companies change all the time. They go bust all the time. They get bought out and reorganized into something else all the time. To think of our fossil fuel commodity producing enterprises as immovable forces, and to also think that we are handing them subsidies. There's a lot of hand holding, that's true. But it's not exactly like that. So if you go inside those entities and look at the pressures that they're under and the bleak future that they're actually looking at and the sad stories they're telling themselves and the really sad stuff that they're doing to try and keep going just a little bit longer, then you see that, wait a minute, we're having a Kodak moment here, actually. You know, we've got companies that see that they are not wanted and they don't have a future. And when companies do that, they either look at what they're really good at, what they can do, and what to move into, or they will continue doing the destruction until they're gone, and that's too late for us. So looking at that business model transition for a company that has exactly what IOCs have, and looking at honestly that the commodity they're producing is not the greatest business model ever. It's too cheap. We're spending the value proposition of what that oil actually does. They're only getting a teeny slice of it, and they're missing out on a huge opportunity to shift their business in a new way. And so I know they can't see that because they're very, very white-knuckled grip onto the business as usual there. But that's how business change happens. So I would love to partner up with some business and economics people in this research area, because I find it fascinating. And actually, of all the stuff I've ever done, I've worked on all of the renewable energies. I've worked on energy efficiency, building retrofits. This is the only one that we get a good future out of. I'm telling you.
Add a couple of points, because I like the question. First thing is, I'd say fossil fuel subsidies are a bit of a distraction, and I think I'm agreeing with Suzan there. You know, they're there in the mainstream discourse for the same reason that carbon pricing is. So the IMF loves to tell everybody, cancel fossil fuel subsidies. That's the best thing you can do. It's not. That's the thing you say when you have no understanding of the systems you're dealing with. For example, in the UK, the capacity market was technically something that allocated fossil fuel subsidies because it paid coal and gas power plants to stay open. That was a crucial part of the package of market reforms and policies that led to the UK having the world's fastest power sector decarbonisation over the course of a decade, 8 times faster than the global average. So fossil fuel subsidies in that context were helpful for a very, very, very fast transition. So it's far more important to look at the sector in question or what is actually going to make it change quickly. Second quick point, the businesses that specialized in making saddles and stirrups and horse-drawn carriages didn't lead the transition from horses to cars. So we shouldn't expect the oil firms to lead the transition to a clean economy. They probably won't, and it doesn't matter. Third quick point, if we do want to help them, as Suzan was saying, then it's really about regulating the sectors to which they sell products. So if you don't want them to sell the dirtiest fossil fuels at the bottom of the barrel into the shipping industry, then we have to regulate shipping so that the demand changes and it wants sustainable fuels instead. Don't think that fossil fuel firms have all the agency. They really don't.
That's such a good point. So we keep hearing, it's up to whichever company to lead the way on this, and it's normally oil and gas, and that's such a good point to take away from. A final question, as we're just coming to the end of our time. A really quick answer from each of you, actually. Interesting to see how your answers may differ with your specialisms. But from Andrew, is it money, training, behaviour change, language, demonstration of evidence, or something else that will make the biggest step change for people moving to deal with climate change? So, Nameerah, I'll come to you first. I'm sorry putting you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I'll keep it simple. I think for us, we believe in the power of communication and the power of language. And that's our biggest takeaway. It does not matter how good the policy is. It does not matter whatever incentives you give. If it's not communicated well, it will not be a success.
Fantastic. Thank you. Suzan, I'll come to you next as you're on my screen.
Right. Well, you said people dealing with climate change. That's a different thing, because our ability to deal with what we've already created, that's a whole project in itself, that's for sure. Taking the foot off the accelerator, now I would say there it's an evolution. Something new that hasn't happened before has to happen. Like I said, there have been lots of people working on lots of solutions in lots of ways, but that is business as usual now, isn't it? I mean, and you can see where we're still going. So these internal transitions to the existing systems that use fossil fuels and producers of fossil fuels that just have to shift to using a small amount of fossil fuel, there's just there's lots of possibility there, but there's not the discipline to do it. So yeah, that an evolution of ourselves to correct ourselves. I think that's where we go.
That's the tagline from today's event that we'll take away from that. That's great. And to finish off, Simon, over to you.
Well, it seems appropriate to say to a government group, never underestimate the power of policy, because policy can reallocate the flow of finance away from the old technologies and towards the new. And that makes the new technologies get good, and that makes it easy for people to change their actions, sometimes without even noticing that they have. So I think that is about the most powerful lever that we have, but they all work together. So each of us just has to pull the levers that we're relatively good at pulling. And don't worry if we can't do everything.
Absolutely. And there's a comment in there, the Stone Age did not end because humans ran out of stones. Brilliant. So thank you from us to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for joining. And I'll hand back to Ian to close the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again to everyone. Thanks for all everyone joining us as well, and our guests as well. Some great comments and thoughts on all of this. Just one final thought about the community. Simon saying about how you can, Simon Sharp saying about how we can all do something that no one else can do. Well, there's something. The Cross Government Climate Hub is something that we can all do, and as public servants, there are millions of people in the country who don't have that privilege of being able to access this kind of network. There's a huge amount of work that we've seen over the last few years of engagement around the public sector that is being duplicated, and the learning is not being shared enough. We've got tremendous challenges facing us over the next few years and decades, and the more connected we are, the more resilient we can be, the more ambitious we can be, and the faster we can address this problem.